All right. How's everyone doing today? Hope you're doing all right. Um, First off, any businessy related questions on your part? Feelings, requests, anything? It can be stuff that I failed to address last time, or questions that came up for you, or anything like that.
No.
All right. Oh, Grace.
No. No.
Okay, none. All right,
No.
awesome. All right, so just two reminders. If you have any questions, comments, concerns today at any point, you are welcome to just raise your voice, turn on your camera, or type in the text chat. I've got the chat bar set up on a second screen. So I'm usually pretty good. If you are wondering why I keep staring over to the right, it's because that's where your chat is. So that is that stuff. If anything comes up after class or you have any questions, you want to shoot me an email, go right ahead. I will respond to it. So with that out of the way, I think that's all the businessy stuff off the bat. It's great to see all you again. So let's get going. So today's topic is going to be pretty straightforward. It's basically going to be what is the philosophy of psychology? And then a short follow-up of why the hell should this class exist and why should you take it and why is it worth learning? So comes down to, well, actually, let's go with just some general questions first. How many of you are psych majors? Out of curiosity. Psych majors. How many psych minors do we have? Okay, we got a few more. Awesome. How many philosophy majors? Okay, awesome. How many how many philosophy minors? Okay, awesome. Okay, so most of you are familiar with either philosophy or psychology. How many of you have taken a psych class? And you can raise your hand again, even if you are a major. I just want to get a general gist of the audience. All right, so about half have taken psych classes. All right, and then how many have taken philosophy classes? Okay, it's about half and half. All right, awesome. I'm just trying to get a feel for what sorts of what the demographic is. If you've never taken a psych class before, that's okay. If you've never taken a philosophy class before, that's okay. Both groups will find things they've not encountered before from the other group. I myself am in the philosophy department, so my tendency is to approach questions in a philosophy type way. So if at any point my way of approaching it is confusing to anyone who's a psych major or is more familiar with psych classes, feel free to be like, Professor, what the hell are you talking about? It's also why we're going to have that class in which I spend a little extra time talking about writing philosophy papers. So those of you who are not familiar with philosophy papers will be a bit more, feel a bit more comfortable going about it. So for some of you who have taken philosophy classes before, the first question I have, which is what is philosophy, might be a boring sort of question. So if anyone wants to give a definition for philosophy, or I can just go ahead and give mine. Like so many things that are interesting to talk about, there isn't really a clear definition, but you can give it a stab if you want to.
Isn't it the study of knowledge? Like philo means knowledge, and then Sophie means either love or study.
So you got it. You're right, almost. So it's the philo is the love part, and then the Safi is wisdom. So not quite knowledge, but very close. So the idea of philosophy is it comes from this Greek, stick them together, the love of knowledge, which isn't very helpful, or the love of wisdom, which isn't very helpful because what the heck does that mean? The way I like to think of philosophy is it's more a method of approaching things. It's a method that goes about attempting to answer questions in a very particular way. And the way of approaching questions is not something magical or different. It's just one of the many ways that we go about answering questions in our everyday lives. It's just we have many different ways of doing it, and philosophy is really just a way of focusing on going about things in a particular way. So, love for knowledge, awesome. So what does this look like? Well, let's just go with a everyday question. Here's a question. Do whales have any hair on their bodies? How might you go about answering this question? There are many ways of doing it. What are some of the ways you might go?
Google images of whales.
Yeah, you might Google search it. So you might go, and what essentially Google searching is what Google searching is drawing on somebody else's knowledge or somebody else's experience to do it. What's another way you might go about this? Marie, what did you say?
I was gonna say you can, like, I guess, deduce your previous knowledge. Like if you know that mammals have hair, you can kind of be like, if a whale's a mammal, they have hair.
Awesome. That's exactly what I was looking for. So another way is deduction, deduce. As I said last time, I can't spell and I can't write. So if at any point you can't read anything or you're like, what does that say? That means whatever. Yeah. Another thing you could do, you think about the conditions that whales live in. And then the final one, and this one's not really practical for any of us, is you can just go find a whale and look at it. So that's the third real way. You can Google, which is drawing on someone else's knowledge. You can look it up yourself. Or what you can do is take knowledge you already have to draw conclusions about new things. So in this case, one thing you might do is like, imagine, I mean, it's COVID, you can't go to the aquarium and find yourself a whale to look at. If your internet goes down, you can't look it up on Google. Somebody else might not know. So your only choice you have is just to think about it. So what you might do is just think to yourself, all right, let me think, what do I know about whales? All right, whales are mammals. That's something that they taught me. They taught me they're not fish, they're mammals. And in science class, they also told me that all mammals have hair. So therefore, if a whale is a mammal and all mammals have hair, then what's the conclusion we have to draw? Whales have hair, which is true. They have like tiny little hairs. They might also have eyelashes. I can never remember, but they've got like very small little hairs on their bodies. They're not perfectly smooth. So that would be the way we could do it. So that deduction or approach way is really what defines philosophy. And and this is nothing special or nothing new. It's just what philosophy does is almost exclusively rely on this way of asking and answering questions. It's about coming up with things you know already, and from those, reaching new conclusions. Now, why is there a whole field devoted to going about things this way? Well, when you're approaching things in this way, the sorts of questions that very often get asked are questions that can't be answered in any other way. So the whale case, you could go about asking about whether or answering whether whales have hair by going to Google or by looking it up yourself. But there are lots of questions that don't have easy answers in those ways. And in those cases, the only thing you can do is think about it. So for instance, like, what is the purpose of life? Or what is the meaning of life? You can't Google search that. You'll get 47,000 different ideas, and none of them will have anything other than, you know, somebody's opinion. You can't just like look yourself. You can't just be like, okay, if I, you know, mix some chemicals together and then there'll be a big cloud and it'll tell me what the meaning of life is. No. Instead, you have to just think about it. Well, what matters to me? Why does that matter to me? Should it matter to me? Other sorts of philosophical big picture questions. Anyone have any ideas of the sorts of things that often come up in this case? There's no right or wrong answers here, but another one that often comes up is things like, does God exist? That's another classic case of like, that's not a question where like you can, unless you're a very special person. I personally have never spoken to a higher being. Maybe you have, but unless you're one of those very small chosen few, you can't just like call up God and be like, God, are you real? And God's not going to respond. You also can't Google search because half the internet thinks it's real and the other half thinks you're crazy. And looking it up yourself, it's just, you're going to get the same thing. All you can do is really think about it. Just think about like, well, what do I know about the world? Well, the world has order. So does that mean that God put the order there, or could it have just been the Big Bang? And so this is the only way you can go about approaching it. So those are this sort of approach, this deductive approach, meaning that you only go about answering questions in this sort of, you take what you know, you gain new knowledge, and then draw new conclusions from it. That's really what defines philosophy. And in a lot of cases, that's asking big picture questions. Or like, what does it mean for something to be right? Or what should I do in this sort of situation? But another sub-branch of philosophy is to apply this method of philosophy to other fields. So for instance, instead of just asking big picture questions, you can instead go, all right, let me apply these deductive sorts of methods to the views and ideas in other fields. So for instance, this is going to be a test of whether you're awake or not. How many of you have taken a math class? Okay, good,
Yeah.
good. You're alive. Awesome.
What's math?
So, so math classes, we've all done it at some point in our lives, but there's a question, how much time did you spend in your math class? You know 2 + 2 = 4, but what is 4? What is it? What is the number 4? Where does it exist? You can think of it, and I can think of it, and we both know that 2 + 2 = 4, but where on earth is 4 living? What does that mean? Is it like, where did it come from? That is a question that gets asked in the philosophy of mathematics. Another question you might have is like, how many of you have been on time for something? How many of you have been late for something? How many of us have thought about time? Every single one of us. So yeah, Conrad says an integer existing on a number line. All right, so what is a number line then? And what is it to exist? What does it mean for something to exist? Like, in a certain sense, I exist, but now here's another thing. I exist, but then also, let's say your favorite movie character, do they exist? In a certain sense, they don't exist because they're fictional, but also in another sense, they do exist because if they didn't exist in any sense, how would you be thinking about them right now? And if they didn't exist in any sense, how could all of us have the same thought about the same movie character? If you and I are talking about, I don't know, Captain America, and you're saying you love Captain America, and I'm saying I hate Captain America, and then we're having an argument about whether Captain America is cool or not, and then we're like, oh, but he doesn't exist, then what on earth are we even talking about? So philosophy of physics or philosophy of science is going to look at things not just like, are you on time or not? It's going to ask things like, what is time? What is time like? What sorts of things do we know about it? So this is generally what philosophy is, and the sorts of philosophy that often get done are to ask these deductive philosophical questions about things like, what is it to exist? What is math? What are the ideas of math? What are the ideas of science? Or in this class, what do we know about the principles and discussions of psychology? And so it's really going to be looking at the sorts of things that psychologists do and their views, and asking the fundamental questions about things in psychology. So instead of asking, let me pull up a couple examples. So a psychologist might ask something like, what are the impacts of childhood abuse on one's adult personality? That is a question a psychologist might look up. They will examine a lot of people who dealt with childhood trauma, dealt with things like abuse, and they will then study, what do these people have in common? A philosopher of psychology is going to ask, all right, but what do we mean by personality? What is somebody's personality? Where does a personality come from? Is it something that you're born with? Is it something that you entirely learn? Is it some combination? And if it's a combination, which parts come from which? To what degree is your personality dependent on your genes? And so these are the sorts of questions that a philosopher of psychology would ask. You take the core principles of psychology and you ask, all right, but what does that mean exactly? What is this? So that's really what we're talking about with the philosophy of psychology. Now, what sorts of principles are there? First off, any questions at this point? This should be rather just big background sorts of stuff. If any of this is confusing, good, that means you're thinking about it pretty hard. The fun thing and the terrible thing about philosophy is because it's just a lot of thinking and you can't ever go and test it out, you never know for sure when you're right and when you're wrong, which is both the greatness of it and the terribleness of it. You're not going to get like 2 + 2 = 7. You're just wrong. There's no way of disproving it. That's just a fact. In philosophy, it's much less clear. And so in this class, when we're looking at principles of psychology, things like what is a mind? What is behavior? These are questions that we are going to think about hard, and coming to answers is going to be useful. But very often in philosophy, you can find out that things are wrong, but it's very difficult to find out what's right. is you can always try to find issues, and you can make progress in the sense of, we now know certain things aren't the case, but we don't yet know for certain what is the case. So that's one thing which can, and if you're somebody who likes to think in black and white terms, there are going to be times in which this is going to drive you insane. But the whole world's gray, so it's good practice. Anyway, any other questions at this point before I jump into the second part, which is psychology, the history of it, and what the hell are we talking about when we talk about psychology in general? Basically, going to do the same thing we had for philosophy, but with psychology. All right. Let me take a sip of water so I don't dehydrate here. I've got this very fun situation, which is where I am in my apartment. The only room has a heater next to it, so I'm sitting next to a radiator. And so to offset the radiator, I also opened the window. So the top half of my body is extremely warm, and the bottom half, or the top half is freezing, and the bottom half is warm. It's great. It's really fun. All right, psychology. What is it? What's the definition of psychology? And the main thing I want to conclude here is that there isn't a good definition, but what are some of the things you may have been told or may have heard?
I would say the study of people in their minds and habitat.
So people, minds, habitats. And so one thing that's super interesting, so study of, and so in a certain sense, this is 100% true. And in another sense, it doesn't quite capture everything about psychology. Because as a matter of fact, and we're going to talk about this shortly, there's a lot of people in the history of psychology who denied that the mind exists, or that we're going to be looking at people who have denied that there are such things as minds as the subject of scientific study. Also, there's brains thrown in there. And then somebody else is going to come along and say, but the mind has nothing to do with the brain. So there's all these issues where, in one sense, the study of the mind, but some people denied minds. And so we can focus on people, but it doesn't seem like it's just people's bodies, because that's just anatomy. In another sense, there's the brain, but it's not just the brain, because that's neuroscience. Joey.
Behavior as well.
Oh, behavior. Yes, thank you. Behavior is another one. Joey, did you have a hand?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, behavior.
Okay, behavior. So, and the thing with behavior, though, which is tough, is a lot of people have wanted to say that, like, behavior is what we're really studying in psychology. But on the flip side, is behavior all that interesting if, like, we don't talk about the mind behind it? Because, like, if you're sleepwalking, or imagine this, imagine somebody takes control of your mind and has complete control over all your movements, and you start killing people, and you start, like, eating children and all the sorts of things somebody might make you do if they took control of your mind, because that's definitely what anyone would do if they had control of your mind. In a certain sense, this isn't in some sense that's a behavior, but in another sense, it's not really like psychology. And then here's another issue. Even the study of bit seems like it's a bit wishy-washy, because there's a lot of people in psychology who don't really do much in terms of studying. Personality is another thing that goes in here. Personality. So it's like psychology is the study of personality, but also there's a lot of parts of psychology that aren't about personality. And again, then we have the issues of what do we mean by personality? Also, the study of psychologists, like when we think of the study of, we think of people in like an academic setting, doing research, writing up stuff. But a lot of people in psychology, it's unclear whether they're doing much studying or just applying principles to help. So for instance, sports psychology is becoming a bigger and bigger field. What do sports psychologists do? Anyone know?
They basically talk to the athletes and like try to get them over their humps and stuff to make them perform better.
Yeah, most professional sports teams these days have a psychologist there who talks to the players to help them deal with any issues. So if a guy is playing poorly and it's really affecting his confidence and he's playing really bad because of it, they go and have him talk to the psychologist who's like, here's some approaches you can use. So in some sense, that's a study of, but it's also like just a teaching or a practical thing. There's also like workplace psychologists or school psychologists, where these people are almost more like doctors or, mental professionals whose job it is to make it better. So in some sense, while we'd say that like doctors study medicine, there's also a sense in which they do a lot of doing of things. Mentality. So anything having to do with like what your mentality is or what your approach to things are, that's also psychology. And so with psychology, there's not really a good definition, because a good definition is something that allows us to say, is this thing an example of that? Like even number. What's our definition of an even number? Divisible by 2. We can know right off the bat, is something divisible by 2 or is it not? And it's either a yes or a no. Is something psychology or not? And so really the best way to kind of think of psychology is kind of historically. So it's got all of these things mixed together. Yeah, and so here's the other thing. A lot of psychologists, so there are a lot of psychologists who are, clinical mental health professionals who help you in a doctor's office environment. These people have never conducted an experiment in their life. On the other side, you've got people in psych departments who spend most of their lives just doing experiments on rats and never talking to human beings. Like both of these extremes, like one person for a living talks to other people. Another person for a living just dissects rats. And yet these are both psychologists. Also, you've got people who just put other people in MRI machines. Those are also psychologists. So what is it that all of these things have in common? Well, we kind of want to say the mind. But there's all these people who said the mind doesn't exist or you can't study it. So what I just want to do for the rest of class briefly is, well, I don't know if it's going to be briefly, but talk about just the history of psychology. Where did it come from? Why on earth is it a thing? And why is it an interesting thing we should care about? Because everything every one of you has said so far about what psychology is true. It encompasses all of these things. But to understand how it all fits together and like how it is that it's the sort of thing that can end up with a philosophy of it, well, it's useful to know the history behind psychology a little bit. So for this first class, it's almost just going to be a who's who within the history of psychology. I'm not going to be doing everything. It's just going to be one class. If none of this sticks because you're bad with names or you just don't care, totally fine. I won't judge you. I won't take it personally. I find history interesting. If you don't, I'm sure there's something you can find on your computer to entertain yourself. But history of psychology. Anyone know when psychology as a field, like it started being talked about as a science? Because psychology in some sense has been around forever as something we're interested in. Like people have been trying to explain everyone else's behaviors for, all of human history. Since before we could write, everyone's been trying to figure this out. But when did it become a field of science?
I feel like with Freud is when it really became field science.
So Freud is a big name in it. I'll be talking about him a little bit more. So Freud is one of the huge names. Does anyone, I can never remember when exactly Freud lived. Freud, let me pull this up. I think he was born in 1856. So he's one of the early fundamental figures, but he's generally not seen as the earliest psychologist. The earliest psychologist is typically said to be this guy named Wilhelm Wundt. I think I'm spelling his name wrong. I need to find some way to get this desk out of here. All right. Wilhelm Wundt, who came up with, his first, also again, I can't spell and it looks like crap, but it's W-U-N-D-T. He started the first psych lab, I think it was in like the 1870s. So the first like fundamental figures in psychology, and one of the first major psychology textbooks was written by William James, and he was writing in late 1800s, early 1900s. Freud lived until 1939. So we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. That's the first time that the human mind came to be thought of as something that could be studied. 1879. Thank you, Alan. 1879 is when Wundt started his lab. So Freud was still pretty young at that point. He would have been in like an undergraduate age. So he wasn't quite there. Now, historically speaking, anyone have any idea why this was the time period that psychology became a science? Anyone have any thoughts on this? Well, for most of human history, where did we think that the personality of a human being was stored, or where did it come from?
The soul?
The soul. For most of human psychology, or most of human history, we thought there was this thing, the soul, and this soul embodied the spirit of the human being. Now, where did this soul, could you measure the soul? No, like the whole definition of it is that it didn't exist in time and space. It was eternal. It could go off into another realm. It could be reborn, depending on your views. But it was not the sort of thing you could study with a science. So if your personality and everything existed in the soul, then that wasn't the sort of thing you could study. Instead, you'd have to ask like a religious figure. So who would you ask? Your priest. Who would you ask? Your rabbi. That's the sort of person, a monk. That's who you would go to for this sort of thing. What changed in the mid 1800s? What fundamentally shifted this view? It was a particular book or a particular guy who wrote a particular book.
Is it like Martin Luther?
So it's a little later than Martin Luther. I think we can think of Luther and that change to a more individualistic approach and thinking of it as less in this giant stream as like setting it off and moving us towards that direction. But Luther was, I think, the late 1500s. Any other guesses? Darwin. Yep. Mikhail. Darwin. Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species. I think it was in 1856. Let me look that up. Origin of Species. 1859. So just flip the number upside down. So Charles Darwin in 1859 writes this book that says the fundamental view is human beings, like everything else in the world, are the result of this complex system of evolutionary change. So that means we, at the end of the day, came about in no way different from a monkey or a whale or anything else. We aren't, in some sense, special. I mean, his interest was much more in the mechanics of it, but one of the implications that people saw very quickly is, well, this means humans aren't that special. We're the same as everything else. We're the same as every other species of animal. And if that's the case, then our behaviors and our abilities should be able to be studied in the same way as any other animal could. So if we can do biology, if we can do that sort of thing on every other animal, it should apply to us as well. And that means one of the many areas that we're going to want to focus on is our thought and our experiences. If we're animals, like Darwin said, then that is something we should be able to do science on. And so that was really the fundamental shift which led to psychology as a field of study. So shortly after Darwin, people started going, oh, if we're animals, let's start studying the mind. And what Wundt did, so the first real push was Wundt, and he set up a lab in which he literally just started testing things like, all right, I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you a button. And the moment you see a light, press the button. Now, how fast do you do it? Let's learn about how the human mind works in this way. Now, I'm going to flash a light. It will either be a red light or a blue light. Now, if it flashes blue, press your right hand, and if it flashes red, press with your left hand. And he just did measurements and studies and this sort of thing. And the ultimate goal was just to understand in the same ways that you could describe physics or you could describe biological evolution, we could describe the processes governing the human mind. And so that was the first push. And Wundt really focused on the most obvious part of our mind or our experience, and that's going to be the conscious stuff. So Wundt and those, especially those who followed him, one of his biggest students or most influential students was a guy named Titchener, who ended up working at Cornell, and he set up like the first psych lab in the United States. And his thing was, let us just examine the effects that things have on your conscious experience. And he had a view called structuralism, and the idea was that we would ultimately be able to explain everything that the mind did and all of conscious experience by breaking it down into parts. So he was doing labs like he'd bring a bunch of people in and go, I'm going to show you a color. Tell me how it makes you feel, and try to find these general patterns. And, if you show a lot of people, if you ask them, like, what temperature do you associate with this? Most people say kind of cold. And if you give somebody something red, they'll be like kind of warm. So these were the early sorts of psych experiments going on. Now, At the same time, there were a few other trends popping up. So, for instance, Titchener was really focused on, and those who followed him were really focused on conscious experience and understanding that. Now, there was another stream, though, which was trying to understand things that weren't fully conscious. And so that's where the name Sigmund Freud comes in. And so Freud was originally trained as a doctor. And what he was really interested in, he got to start looking at people with what at the time was called hysteria. And so what hysteria was basically psychosomatic illness. So if somebody is really mentally has happened such that they have certain feelings in their body. It can be a pain, or suddenly they won't be able to move one of their legs. And so this was a thing that was happening a lot during this time. And my guess is a lot of his patients at around this time were also going to be like war veterans who dealt with shell shock and PTSD and that sort of thing. So this was at a time before anyone had a name for this stuff. But you had people who had all these illnesses, but you went in as a doctor and you found like there's nothing physically wrong with their body. So what's going on? What explains this? Well, it's also not something that, like, clearly it's something has happened here, and the hunch was it was mental, but it wasn't accessible to their conscious awareness. These people with genuine psychosomatic situations are not aware that they're doing this. It's not like they go in and are like, I have a pain in my arm and they're lying about it. It's rather they really feel pain and there's something about it and something about their mind which has led this to be the case. So Freud looked at this and said, all right, if we're going to try to understand human beings, we can't just look at the things we're consciously aware of. We also have to look at the unconscious. I can't reach that far, so I'm just going to write it like that. All right, unconscious. So he came, and like there's a ton of views about Freud and all sorts of other things. I'm not going to get into the details. I'm sure you've all heard the caricatures that everything's a penis and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of his ideas, we look back on them and are like, that's crazy. But there was a lot of other things. He was really the first person who started really trying to map human are we going to learn about the id or conscious, unconscious in more detail? Alvin, we might be talking about it later in the semester, but we aren't going to dive too deep into Freud's like actual details of it, just because these days, many of the elements of his views on consciousness and unconsciousness are kind of a lot of the details of his views are treated as antiquated. If you ever wanted to talk to me about it, I'm happy to like meet up and we can chat. But in terms of talking about the details of Freud's views on unconscious processing and unconscious forces, we won't be talking too much. But the fundamental idea that a lot of what happens with human beings is unconscious is a view that dominates psychology today and is something we're going to be coming back to again and again. And just the degree to which so much of our processing happens at a subconscious level. And much of what you do is subconscious, but the view is not going to be the Freudian sort of like elemental forces and the things under the water level with the id and the sexual suppression and that sort of stuff. So he came along as going with unconscious stuff. Now there was a third sort of movement, which kind of grew up in response to these two. So what Freud was really doing is he was trying to map like the contours of the unconscious mind. But the way he did it was in a way that involved like a lot of having someone describe their dreams and then analyzing the dreams. So if like you saw a dream in which a man had like there was a sky full of hot dogs flying along. Freud's interpretation was these hot dogs symbolized human male genitalia, and this was a sign of sexual frustration. So it was this sort of like, we interpret the dreams, or Freudian slips, which is if somebody says one thing by accident, that shows in some sense what their unconscious desires are. So if somebody's talking about washing dishes in the sink, but accidentally says drink, that's a sign that they might have an alcohol problem or something like that. So that would be the sort of like their unconscious desire is to push for alcohol and that sort of thing. So those were the sorts of, and this is all a little bit over like caricature-y. So there's more substance to Freud, but this was kind of the way in which people from the outside were looking at Freud's work. And one thing that's really important to notice, just like a background thing about the history of ideas and about how fields develop, is it's very often not what somebody's actual views are that end up doing most of the work. It's what everybody else interprets that person's views to be. So for instance, with Darwinism, Darwin was not somebody who believed in races or racism in the sense of like Nazi propaganda, but Nazi propagandists were able to see in Darwin this idea of like, oh, well, the strong survive, white people have all the power right now, that shows white people are better. But so Darwin never held that view, but people started jumping on board. So in some sense, it became Darwin's legacy that took a while for people to reclaim. And somewhere along the line, people realized like, oh no, it has nothing to do with your race that made Europeans stronger. It was just like accidents having to do with gunpowder and who found some metal and various other things. So in the same sense, this kind of caricatured version of Freud is really the one that kind of got pushed into history and kind of affected the way things developed. So there's a lot more to be said about the man than we are saying now, and there's a lot more subtlety than a lot of people often say. But at the end of the day, it was a lot of interpretation of dreams and things like that to understand the unconscious. And so it took like a trained dream reader in some sense. So that's the background. We had Wundt and then Titchener especially with the structuralists studying the mechanisms of consciousness. Freud was looking at the unconscious and the way that affected things. Now, both of these groups were then opposed by a third group, which is going to be behaviorists. And this group probably, we can say, started a little bit later. The most famous behaviorist is B.F. Skinner, who worked mostly in the 50s. And so what behaviorism wanted to say is they were really focused on, like, at about this time, psychology was really trying to prove that it was a science and it was worthy of having departments in universities. Because, you know, there were physics departments and biology departments, but psychology was coming along and they were like, we deserve to be a department too. And because it was such a new field, you had to actually argue for that. You had to prove that you were worthy of your time. And what behaviorists were starting to feel was, all right, if we look at Wundt and Titchener, all right, this sort of stuff is interesting. Yeah, I show you a blue light and you feel cold. But what the hell does that do for me? How is that going to convince a department that they need a psych lab? And even more importantly, what is this going to do for society as a whole? What is the point of learning all of these things? Well, that's not very interesting. And more importantly, like, how would you go about measuring it? Like, how do you measure whether something is cold when you like make someone think of coldness or make someone think of blueness? And they also had a similar sort of worry about Freud's unconscious views, because psychoanalytic is generally what it's called. Freud and psychoanalytic views. Psychoanalytics is generally the one associated with Freud, yeah. So structuralism, behaviorism, psychoanalytic. And now one thing that's worth mentioning is all of these views are still alive and people still hold them. It's just the way that psychology exists today, and what I'm going to talk about how these mix together, is they kind of take elements of every single one. In the United States, as a matter of fact, so it started out with Titchener, but by the 50s in the United States, behaviorism was really the dominant view. And psychoanalysis in the United States never really took off in academic departments. It's almost in a certain way, one of the interesting things is Freud came to be embraced more by like artistic communities in a certain way, and like had major influences in literature, but in actual psychology departments, he was often not embraced nearly as much in the United States. So the behaviorist view was, we want psychology to be a real field. We want it to be as good as physics. We want it to be as good as chemistry. And if we're doing that, we can't be going around just interpreting people's dreams. We can't be just asking people, how does this make you feel? We need things that are measurable. We need things we can test in a lab. We need things that you can actually run studies on and learn interesting things that we can then like say, if you do this, this will happen. And so what they decided to do was focus entirely on human behavior. And so it came, the whole idea of like Skinner's motto in extreme behaviorism was, the idea was we throw the mind out entirely. All psychology is a study of behavior. All we need to concern ourselves with are the environmental conditions that an organism is placed in, the history of experiences that they've had, specifically their history of being rewarded for certain behaviors and punished for others, and then measure what they actually do. And that's the only thing psychology should be concerned with. And if it does anything more than that, it ceases to be something that's worthy of being a science. So what motivated Skinner to hold this belief? Well, there was some sociological stuff. It took off. One of the big driving forces for why behaviorism took off was this little event you might have heard of called World War II. With World War II, it was the way it got portrayed was we had the Nazis who believed in internal human differences and the Western democracies that believed as long as you're brought up in the right way, anybody's capable of greatness, and the good guys who believe that won. And so what behaviorism was basically saying was your internalness doesn't matter. So it was kind of born into this era in which behaviorism, it found fertile ground in academic circles because as a society, we were looking for an explanation of humanness that didn't build it on, differences that people are born with or the way they look or anything like that. And so that was kind of the background. And then what Skinner started to do is basically he got into a lab and found you could come up with a lot of really great and interesting discoveries by running sorts of experiments. So what is Skinner most famous for? Does anyone know? His the name, the mechanism that bears his name. Anyone know?
Skinner's box.
Yeah, Skinner
classical
boxes.
Conditioning.
Yeah. Wait, say the second part again.
Classical conditioning.
He was actually operant conditioning. So I'm skipping Pavlov because I'm lazy, more than we just don't have time. But he was operant conditioning in the Skinner box. So what was the Skinner box? You're gonna get to see some beautiful art now. Here's a Skinner box. It's, like the name suggests, a box. And what is in this box? Well, in this box, amongst other things, oh, actually, no, I need to do this part. This is just turning into a disaster. Oh, there we go. That doesn't look too bad. All right, in this box, what was there? Amongst other things, there is a little bar. What else is in here? Anyone know? A rat. That's the key. There has to be a rat. That's a rat. And then the other key is this bar is attached to a little, it's a little lever, which is attached to out here. There's a big pile of food. And what happens is if the rat presses the bar, food comes out. And so basically so there was also a light. There were a few different versions of this. But yeah, the key is there's a rat or a pigeon. There's some food and there's a very basic item. So if the rat touches the bar hard enough, a piece of food will come out. And what Skinner started measuring was basically things like, well, how long until the rat discovers this? And then things like, how many hours of not feeding the rat will lead to how long of the rat pressing the bar. So very interestingly with these rats, first time it just sniffs around, it leans on the bar by accident, and some food comes out. But then very quickly what ends up happening is the rat discovers what? Well, if I leaned on this bar, some food came out. And so what does the rat do very quickly? It just starts sitting there and just pounding on the bar over and over again because it's I want food. So this was something that you could study. You could study how many times will the rat press the bar to get food. And they made a lot of really interesting discoveries. So for instance, they very quickly were able to identify that if you put it on a fixed number of presses, so if the food came out every 3 presses, the rat very quickly learned that you just press the bar 3 times. And so they would do studies of how long does it take the rat to learn this? If you put it at 50 times, the rat would very quickly just keep pressing it until the food came out. There was actually a case they did it with pigeons. And the pigeon, one of the pigeons would peck the little food button so fast, its little pigeon nose caught on fire because it was pressing it that quickly to try to get its little pigeon food. And then so that was one interesting thing. And then what they started discovering is if you change around if it's a variable sort of thing, so you never know exactly when the food's going to come. On average, it's 1 every 25 times. But you never quite know for certain, the rat will keep pressing it forever, even if you then detach the food bowl, the rat will keep pressing it. And what this shows is, well, organisms are such that if they think a result is possible and that result is positive, they will keep going for it, even if all their present evidence is nothing's coming, which is a lot like human gambling behavior. So this was a case in which he was saying, look, we can explain something like human gambling behavior. You win the first time you ever gamble, and if you got the hook for it, it doesn't matter if you lose for the rest of your life, you will keep gambling. And so he was like, look, we can explain this complex human behavior. Here's another one. How many of you have had, what's a food item you can no longer eat because the last time you ate it, you threw up? Anyone have these cases? Mine for a long time was baby carrots. It took 20 years before I could eat baby carrots again. And very often with these sorts of things, like I only had to throw up one time. I had baby carrots and I happened to get a stomach bug at the same time. And for 20 years, no baby carrots. Yeah, ground beef. Yeah, so taste aversion. Shrimps. Everyone seems to have one or know someone who's had one or at some point had one. And it only took one time. Why? Well, Skinner discovered something else, which was if you put a rat in a cage and instead of having food here, what you do is you give it a little like ramp thing it could stand on, and then you have a light here. And when this light turns on, 3 seconds later, the floor zaps with electricity. And the rat, nobody likes being electrocuted. So this rat leaps up onto its little thing. Now, the next time the light turns on, even if it was just once this happened before, the rat will continue for the rest of its life to avoid the floor anytime a light turns on. So here was another case in which it's like, oh, human avoidance behavior, taste aversion, things like this. This is something we can study with rats. We see this behavior, we can measure it. It takes just one time and the behavior changes. And so Skinner thought that this was giving us major insights into how minds work, and it did it in a way that we could measure, we could get information, and we could study it. You could count how many times the rat pressed the bar. You could count how many times it got zapped. So ZS is this the same thing with Pavlov and the dogs. There's a slight difference here. Let's take a tangent, what the hell. Pavlov's dogs was the first experiment to involve this sort of thing. But the key difference between Pavlov's dogs and Skinner's experiments is Pavlov's. So are people familiar with the Pavlov dog experiment? Basically what he did is you ring a bell and then you give a dog some food, ring a bell, give a dog some food. Every time the bell rings and then it gets the food, it just starts salivating because dogs love food. What they discovered, classical conditioning. This was classical conditioning. And basically what you discover is if you do this enough times, just ringing the bell will cause the dog to salivate. They have associated the experience of hearing a bell with the expectation of food, which causes them to salivate. Now, the main difference here between operant conditioning and this is that in classical conditioning, it's just a physiological response. Like, you cannot make yourself drool. You can't just be like, all right, drool. That's not something you have a control over. It just, you smell food or you expect food or you start thinking about food and it just happens. With operant conditioning, it is a behavior. So it wasn't just the light would turn on and the rat would jump. It was rather the light would turn on and the rat would, in some sense, like it wasn't just something that happened inside the rat. It was a physical, viewable, muscular behavior. In the same way, the rat would press a bar, like in some sense, in a decision-making process, not in the sense of like you scare a rat and its heart beats faster. That's not something you can control. So that's the major difference between classical and operant conditioning. Classical just kind of happens. The conditioned behavior just happens. Or it's not even really a behavior. It's like a conditioned response. It's like a physiological response. With operant conditioning, it's an actual behavior that is rewarded. And then there's a behaviorist would never use this language because, as I said, a behaviorist denies the importance of bringing the word mind into psychology. But in the sorts of behaviors that we talk about with operant conditioning, it makes sense to talk in terms of something choosing to do it. Again, a behaviorist wouldn't ever say that, but you don't choose to salivate. You do choose to press a bar. So that's the fundamental difference here. All right, let me close this out and pull up my notes again. All right, so that's really the background that we have, is there were these three the three general views. There was the structuralists with the and they weren't perfectly contemporaneous, and they have overlaps in time. And if anything, structuralism kind of died out first, and then psychoanalytic theory kind of continued in a different strand, especially through Europe and then through the arts. And then you had in the United States, behaviorism was really the view. And so up until around like the 1950s or 60s, this is kind of where we were. And then around that time, there was a major shift that took place. And this major shift is generally called, like, I don't know, I've heard it called a revolution or whatnot, but it's basically, you can think of it as like a shift toward a cognitive shift or a cognitive revolution. And basically what the cognitive revolution was it was a view that took elements from all these different viewpoints and kind of combined them together into this thing, psychology, that we have today. And so one of the major kind of movements towards this, and this was a refutation of behaviorism as a view. And the name most closely associated with that is Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky is known as the father of linguistics, but in a lot of ways, he's really fundamental in psychology, as leading to this shift in more modern times of the way that we approach questions today. So basically, what Chomsky did was, actually, let me rewind a moment to Skinner. Skinner's view was that all human behaviors could be explained in these behavioristic terms. Anything as complicated as language, anything as complicated as like everything you have could be explained in behavioristic terms. We don't need to bring the mind in. Chomsky was one of the first ones to start giving examples of things that did not fit this category. And the ones he really focused on were language acquisition. So children's language became this battleground in the 50s and 60s. This was a case of something that Chomsky argued you couldn't explain in behaviorist terms, because the key with behaviorism is the way you condition an animal to behave differently is you give it rewards and punishments. So the reason the rat jumps up is it's been punished, or it's had some sort of negative thing which caused it to avoid being around a flashing light ever again. Why does the rat press the bar? Well, because it's going to get rewarded. Well, Chomsky went to language and said, language is an example of something that doesn't look like it can be explained this way. And so things he pointed to were the fact that every child in the world has the ability, just about every child who is exposed to language during a certain age automatically picks up language. And in many cultures, children aren't explicitly taught language. In the United States, you have like the mom going, here, what is this, baby? This is doggy. And then baby says doggy and you give it a little pat on the head. But in many other places, that isn't the case. And yet in these other cultures, children are still learning language just as well. Other things he noticed were that in a classical or in an operant conditioning, it shouldn't matter at what age you're being taught. As long as you go through the right sorts of trials, you should be able to learn something new. Chomsky pointed out that if you don't learn your first language by age like 15, you are never able to learn a language. So there's been cases of like terrible cases of children who were like kept locked in the closet for 20 years by their parents, and they never were able to learn language even when they were brought out and taught it. So there was this push to start to say, wait, there are certain things that behaviorists can't explain. And so it seemed like to explain what was going on in these cases, we needed to bring the mind or bring cognition back in. And so there was this push after behaviorists had kind of gotten the psychology departments into the universities by pushing this strong behaviorist line. And then what happened is people started going, wait, now that we're in here, we can start actually thinking about the fact like, no, minds are a thing. They are something that exists. And if we're going to do science, we need to study them. And so the second important thing that Chomsky did was he started finding, focusing specifically on linguistics, that human linguistic behavior seems to be rule governed and complicated, while also being unconscious and seeming to stem from, like, we can't explain it entirely in terms of behavior. There has to be something mental in there. but it also is something that is incredibly rule governed. And every human being who's fluent in a language follows these incredibly complex rules in ways that you can describe in scientific ways, even though it's not something that's conscious. So he was kind of combining this idea of Freud, of there being unconscious forces, but then saying we can apply to the unconscious the same level of explanatory power that someone like a behaviorist would give for behavior, or someone like Titchener would give for conscious experience. And so just to show you an example of this would work better if I had a guaranteed knowledge of the fact that this will work. Basically, long story short, I am only incredibly fluent in English. So this example is going to involve English. So if you are a native English speaker, you will get this intuition very strongly. If you are not a native English speaker, it might not come through quite as strongly. But this is an example of the sorts of rules that we seem to follow with language that we can't explain in terms of our conscious awareness. It's just, there's some explanation for this. So here's a case. Imagine you've got mice in your house. You decide that you need to develop a special device that will catch the mice that are running around. What might you call this device? Well, say it's a mice catcher. Now, imagine you just want to catch one mouse. What would you call this thing?
Mouse catcher.
A mouse catcher. Mouse trap would work too, but let's just call it a mouse catcher or mouse trap. Now, what if you wanted to catch one rat? What would you call it? Rat catcher. Now here's the key one. Say you wanted to catch 1,000 rats. What would you call it?
Still rat catcher.
Yeah, it's still a rat catcher. Nobody wants to say rats catcher. How many of you have this feeling that no, there's something wrong about calling it a rats catcher? That just sounds terrible to my ears. And I know a lot of other people who share this, and just about everybody for whom English is a first language, rats catcher sounds awful. Why is this? Now, here's the actual explanation. The explanation has to do with the way sentences are constructed in the mind. The explanation is that a word like mouse is irregular. Therefore, we have to store in our minds, in some sense of store, the word mouse and a separate entry for the word mice. But rat is a regular word. And so somehow in our mind, we know that to pluralize rat, it becomes rats. Now, here's another thing. You can't put a word, and in your mind, these are not stored as one thing. You don't have rat stored in there and rats also stored in there. You have rat in there and you have another thing, s, which means plural. And then what your mind does when you're speaking or understanding is it sticks the s here. And now for some reason, English has a rule that you can't put the plural marker next to, like in the middle of one of these added together phrases. It's just something that is ungrammatical in English, which goes back to this statement by Alvin that English is mad complicated. And it's not just English. Every single language is mad complicated. There are many languages, like compared to a lot of languages, English is like child's play. I know that you're told like English is complicated, but like there are some Native American languages, I think it's Navajo, every single verb is irregular. So you know how like we have run, ran, running, and then but then we have lots of like totally normal words where it's just, you know, like well, what's an ordinary, no, right, wrote, what is a normal jump? Jumps, jumped, jump. And there's a whole bunch of ones that are like that. You could have like, if you come up with a new word like I don't know, snog, snogged, snog, for those of you who are on your British vernacular. So all of these sorts of things are following these rules. There are languages in which every single word is irregular. These are languages, a lot of them die out because they've actually found you cannot learn these languages as an adult. You just never become able to do it. It's so complicated. So these were things like this sort of rule here. Every single English speaker follows this rule. And for every language, there are rules like this, where you follow these incredibly complicated rules. And yet no English speaker, until they're taught this, is aware. They just automatically know that it's rat catcher, no matter how many rats there are. Somehow in our brain, and the way you have to explain it is say basically, your mind is somehow running some sort of almost like a software program that knows how to do these sorts of things. And that's kind of a final thing I want to bring in terms of the cognitive shift, is the final thing that really led us to the psychology as we have it today is the invention of the computer and the proliferation of the computer across the society. Because what a computer basically is a piece of machinery that is able to do something that looks a lot like thinking. And it's able to do it by running programs and having symbols for things that stand for other things and combining the symbols together. And so this kind of, when you had Chomsky and those like him who were saying in linguistics, we can explain incredibly complicated things. Alvin asks, what's the plural of moose? That's a damn good question, and I never know what to do. I typically say meese just to be funny, but I know it's not meese. Yeah, there are so many. Goose is geese, so I want to say moose is meese. But you know, English, and this is why English is such a disaster of a language. I think technically, if you looked in a dictionary, the official pronunciation or the official pluralization is mooses or moose, singular. The full history of English is itself a crazy thing having to do. It's basically, why is English so messed up? You can thank the Vikings and the French. That's who you can thank. They both well, you can thank some Germans who showed up first. Then some Vikings came in and kicked their asses and imposed their language accidentally. And then some French came along and did the same thing. And so that's how we ended up with English. Yeah, I could go. In case you can't tell, I love language, and I'm gonna do my best this semester not to impose my nerddom on you. I think language is the coolest thing in the world. I think it's the most fascinating thing in the world. It's literal mind control. Like what language use is I control your mind. I make some sounds, and despite the fact that you are hundreds, thousands of feet, miles, light years away, I am able through the things I'm doing to make your mind think of something. If I say, purple octopus, you are now thinking of a purple octopus. Like that is some cool shit. All right. Anyway, back on this. So because computers were coming along, and it seemed to show a way in which not only was it that we were starting to find that the unconscious processing of the human mind seemed to follow rules, like in the linguistic cases. Also, we started to find that computers could model these things and do these things. So why couldn't we start to think like, oh, if we see it works with computers and we see there are rules for the mind, why don't we just start thinking about the mind as the sort of thing that can be described in these sorts of rule-governed ways? And that's really what psychology today is it's the study of the mind as something that can be studied and given law-like rules in the same sort of way that physics could be, or the same sort of way that biology could be. And now there are individual differences between people that need to be accounted for, but there are also incredible similarities. And so what psychology really is as a field is, let us take for granted that there is a thing, the mind. And this thing, the mind, is what makes us think. And this is the cognitive mechanism. It's also the thing that makes us feel and see and smell. Let's assume that this thing is real. And let's assume that we can do real science on it and learn the sorts of law-like regularities that you'd find in other things. Now, if we take that as the assumed background, where does that lead us? What can we discover? And so what psychologists do in most cases is try to find these principles that govern the sorts, like the rules that account in the same way that we have these linguistic rules. What are the rules that govern vision? What are the rules that govern thought? What are the rules that govern emotions? And so that's really the background. Or things like child development. At what stage is it that a child develops a new rule to, what is walking? Well, walking involves a whole lot of balancing and other things. At what age does a different child learn these sorts of things? What is it about the human mind that means that children basically the world over all start to walk at about the same stage? So that's really what psychology is looking at. And so in a certain sense, at the end of the day, the correct answer, what is psychology is the study of the mind. But that doesn't really capture the full picture of how all the parts fit together. And so what we're going to do in the philosophy of psychology then is look at some of the things that pop up in these sorts of descriptions, and then ask the sorts of big picture philosophical, you can't approach them in any other sort of way questions. So for instance, our first question is something like, can we do without minds and just do brain science? So one thing you might say is like the human mind, it's the study of the mind, but at the end of the day, all we mean by mind is the human brain. That's what we're really ultimately studying. And really psychology should just cease to exist and we should all do neuroscience. So that's one thing of like, what does the mind get us? This isn't something you can find out in a lab. You can't just like test and be like, all right, where does the mind end and where does the brain begin? It's rather you have to ask like, what is the significance of talking about minds? Why do we think and talk in terms of minds and beliefs and desires and wants instead of just saying activation in this corner of the brain? So that'll be our first one. So here's a question of like, you can ask when somebody gets angry, which part of the brain lights up? You can ask when someone gets angry, how likely are they to punch something? But you can also ask something like, all right, but why do we need to talk in terms of anger instead of just talking in terms of the brain science? Another thing we'll be looking at is just like, when we're talking in terms of to what degree can we take this idea of the human mind as a computer and run with it? Can we think of the human mind as running a sort of program? And what can we learn from that? Because a lot of psychologists assume that essentially you can think of the mind in some sense as running is like a software program that's running on a brain hardware. And what are some of the implications of that? Does that mean necessarily you could have a mind that existed outside of a brain? Could you install a mind on a computer? These are the sorts of like philosophical questions that come up when you're asking questions about these psychological views. Other things we'll be looking at later in the semester are then what are the philosophical or what are the big picture implications of psychology? So not starting with like the first half of the semester, we'll be looking at like psychology literature and really examining like the definitions in it and saying like, what does it mean? Like, I think, that's something we all think we do. We all think and we all think we think, but what does that mean? How does that work? When I'm thinking, how is it that I'm thinking, mechanically speaking? Also, how is it that I am able to, I have never been to the city of Tokyo. And yet in some sense, I can think about Tokyo. What on earth does that mean? How can something in here be about a city that, I don't know what direction east or west is. So somewhere out there is a city that I've never been to, have never seen, and yet I can have thoughts about. How does that work? And then the second half is going to be, all right, now let's look at some of these psychology things and what sorts of implications do that have for certain sorts of philosophical views. So things like evil. In our everyday life, we think there are good things and we think there are evil things. And very often, if you've seen any, superhero movie or anything else, the good guys are good and they're the heroes and the bad guys are evil villains. But in actuality, what leads to the sorts of behaviors that we say are evil? Like if somebody kills someone else, does that say something about their essence as a person? Or is there some other explanation? If it turns out that really what it was is they were beaten as a child, and they were beaten as a child because their parent was also beaten as a child. And if we trace this backwards, at what point do we say like, people aren't evil, they just have fucked up childhoods? Like, and what implications does that mean? If all that happened, so yeah, there's a question of, are all humans inherently evil? Are all humans inherently good? There's a lot of evidence that human beings are not just motivated, like we are programmed to do nice things to each other to a certain degree, but we're also programmed to treat people unlike us very poorly. And like the degrees to which things like principles of psychology can explain things like why is it so easy to get people to believe conspiracy theories on the internet? Well, we can give a psychological explanation for this major everyday ethical sort of thing. Like, here's a philosophical question. Why are we prone to, this is borderline philosophy, but like conspiracy theories, why do we fall prey to them? That's something with practical implications. Also, yeah, we're programmed for survival. So like, what do aspects of the ways our psychologists have found our mind is responding to certain evolutionary pressures, how has that led to our having certain tendencies? So for instance, why is it that we all have a tendency to overeat in certain situations? Or why is it that just about everyone loves eating junk food? Well, you can give a psychological examination for it, and then you can ask a question like, okay, so does the person who's overweight because they eat too much junk food, is that just because they're a human being who's programmed in a certain way? And if so, do we really want to like punish our child who's been eating too much candy? Or is it really just they're a child who's programmed in a certain way? Another sort of one of, let me scroll down. One last one, these sorts of things are, as we understand the psychological principles behind things, we can start to see the impacts this has going the other way on technology. So for instance, self-driving cars are something that they were very, very excited to do and design. What is a self-driving car? You press a button and it drives all over. There's currently a pause on most of the research into self-driving cars. Anyone know why?
I've like listened to stuff on this. It's basically like if two were to come into an accident, they would know exactly how to crash, and then the cars would decide essentially which car to crash worse, and then they would have to decide who to kill.
Yeah, basically what they've discovered is there are certain sorts of ethical decisions that human beings can make very quickly. So you're driving along the road. To the left side, you see a car that you could hit. On the right side, you see a little grandma that you might hit. You're losing control of the car. You have to turn one way or the other. Or another one is you see a mother with a child, or you see like a little old lady. You have to decide in this case which way to turn. Most human beings are able to make these decisions very, very quickly. Whether you agree with the decision or not, people can make these decisions quickly. They find cars, the amount of programming that has to go in to get the car to make this sort of decision is astronomically more complicated than they were expecting. Also, another issue is something as simple as, is the thing in front of me a person? If you're driving a car and somebody's crossing the crosswalk, you are generally very good. You can tell almost instantaneously, is the thing walking in front of me a person? It doesn't take a lot of thought. They've discovered computers are really, really, really bad at it. Like, they're getting better, but like if you just marched like a cardboard that looked like a person, the car would slam on its brakes. If you marched, there have been cases in which like a box rolled across the road, the car slammed on its brakes. And basically what they find is the human eye is just so much better at this than robots. So another thing that comes up is, well, if we know this about human psychology, what are the implications for things like ethics, for things like our new technologies? So these are ways in which it kind of goes both ways. We'll be looking at both philosophical questions about psychological principles, but also we'll be looking at the philosophical or big picture ethical, metaphysical implications of psychology. So why is this worth doing? Well, as I said, some of these things have practical implications. And also, I just think this stuff, like, if you have an interest in human thought or how human beings do things or why human beings do things, it's worth understanding more about the underlying mechanisms that are under this stuff. So, and a lot of you are philosophy majors. So if you enjoy doing philosophy, this is a great thing because like so much else, mind, thought, no easy answers. And on the flip side, if you're a psychology major or someone at all interested in it, these are questions you're not really going to take the time to ask in a psychology class. And they have a lot of interesting practical implications. All right. So at that point, I'm done for now. I used the whole class period. Sorry I had to rush there at the end. If anyone needs to go. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them now. And Alvin, I'll answer your question once everybody has who's left has left. I will see those of you who are leaving on Monday. The reading for next Monday is up on the blackboard and you're good to go. So thank you all for today. Have a great night. All right. Alvin, your question, do you think the world would be a slight better place if it was mandated that all cars be self-driving? So I think that if we could have cars, I'm gonna shut the recording off because this isn't really apropos anything. I think if we had the technology